Hello and welcome to Color with Kendi. So today we're going to walk through the Amazing Watercolor Brush Pack for Procreate. I want to walk you through every single brush. And this video is for anyone who's purchased the set and who really wants to get the most out of the brushes. But sometimes you buy brushes and you don't know what to do. Well, I'm here to help you. I'm going to tell you exactly how to use these brushes. If you haven't yet purchased the brush pack and you're interested in finding more, you can find a link in the pinned comment and in the description. Let's begin. Once you've completed the purchase, you'll get a bunch of different files. There will be a brush set file that you can import directly into Procreate. If you need any help, there is a link for you in the description to show you how to import. And then you will have a bunch of other files. There's a reference PDF. There's an 8 by 10 inch paper canvas, 4800 by 6000 pixel canvas, so it's quite large. And there's a brush tutorial canvas. So for this video, you'll want to open up this brush tutorial canvas. And what we're going to do is we're going to test out all of these brushes together in this canvas. And I'm going to walk you through some of the nuances so you know exactly how to use these brushes. There are 26 brushes, and hopefully by the end of this video, you will be a pro and you'll know exactly how to use each brush. We have a lot to cover in this video, so if you would like to skip around, you can check out the chapter timestamps in the description and the pinned comment as well. So the first thing we're going to do is open up the layer menu and make sure that you're on the basic watercolor layer. And then you want to go to the brush library and make sure that you have the Amazing Watercolor set selected. It should be at the top if you've recently imported it. And we're going to start talking about this brush right here. It's called Simple Watercolor Pigmented. We will get to these brushes up at the top a little bit later in this video. So this Simple Pigmented brush is a brush that I would use for laying down base colors. I want you to select any color of your choice. Don't go with a very light color though, something that's a little bit darker. Whenever you test brushes, I do find that it works a lot better with slightly darker colors. So what we're going to do now is we're going to zoom in and make sure that you have size 30, which is the first preset size selected. So these are preset sizes. And these are sizes I use the brushes at the most, and I've offered this as a way for you to just tap and quickly change the size, but you can definitely change the size of the brush according to your needs. So at preset size 30, what you'll see is depending on how much pressure you apply, you can get thinner and thicker lines. And there's a very, very slight taper. And this brush is really great for filling in your base layers. And there's a subtle watercolor gradient. You see there's some areas that are a little bit lighter than others. Very subtle. Now with this brush, something to keep in mind is if you lay down some color, lift your pencil, and then lay down some color again, you will get some of this transparency effect. So there will be an overlap. That's much like what happens in real life in watercolor when you have two different layers. You will have some overlap. If you want to avoid the overlap while you're filling out a shape, just make sure you don't lift the pencil while you fill in the shape. Okay, so now let's move on to dark outline A. We're going to zoom in again and do the same thing. Change up your pressure and see what happens. So this brush has a slightly different texture inside compared to the pigmented one. You can see I didn't change the color, but this is much lighter than this. This is definitely way more pigmented. And depending on how hard or soft you press, you'll get a slightly different result. Now let's move on to dark outline B, which has a little bit of a different edge compared to dark outline A. Whenever there's an A and a B brush, they are quite similar, but there is usually one big difference. In this case, it's the jaggedness of the edge. So let's test this one out. Let's zoom in, and I'm going to use the middle preset size, which is size 20. When you zoom out, you'll be able to see the difference between the brushes. The simple watercolor Pigmented is great for base shapes where you want a really pigmented color. And when you want less pigment and you want more of that gradation between the colors, some white peeking through and some color, then go with Dark Outline A. And Dark Outline A has a very apparent dark edge. So if that's something that you like, definitely use this one. And if you want more of a rough, jaggedy edge, but you still want that dark edge, then go with Dark Outline B. These are all great for laying down the base colors of your shapes. Now let's move on to the next segment. We're going to tap on the Layers menu, turn this layer off, tap on Specialty Watercolor, and turn it on. And we're going to test out the next 3 brushes. So we're going to test out Dual Color Magic. And if you've never used a dual color brush, let me show you how to use one. So let's go to the brush menu and tap on Dual Color Magic. This is one of my favorite brushes because it's kind of cool when you have 2 colors. So what you want to do is tap right here on the color menu and make sure that you are on disc mode. And what you'll see is there are 2 colors right here. Whenever you have a dual color brush, you can select any 2 colors that you want. So what I'm going to do is I'm quite happy with the first color. I want to change the second color to something a bit different so you can really see what happens. So tap on the second color and let's see, maybe I change it to purple or maybe something close to red. Okay, so now I have 2 different colors. Normally I don't use very different colors when I use this brush, but I wanted to show you what it can do. So that's why I'm using 2 very different colors. And now let's start using the brush. So I am on the preset size, which is 55, the larger one. So depending on how much pressure you apply, you'll see more or less of one of the colors. But basically you will see both of the colors, but you need to vary the pressure. So now if I create a shape, and let's say I fill it in, depending on how much pressure I'm applying, I'm not lifting my pencil, but depending on how much pressure I apply, I will get a different mix of the 2 colors. And this brush has a little bit of a taper, actually a lot of a taper towards the end. So if you want that sort of effect, this is a great brush to use. And every single time you use it, you'll get slightly different results depending on how much pressure you apply. So what would you use this brush for? You can use it to fill in shapes. That's definitely a choice. I actually like this for botanicals, for leaves. I'll show you. So I'm going to pick 2 colors that are kind of more leafy, I guess. And I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to zoom here. So what you can do is you start off with light pressure, and then you build up the pressure, and then you can create leaf shapes, which is really cool. And you can vary the pressure. So because this is a pressure sensitive brush, it's really great to create these kind of leaf shapes, flowers as well. So just change up the colors, and what you'll notice is that you get very interesting results depending on how much pressure you apply. So you get that variation, which is very nice. So that's the Dual Color Magic brush. Let's move on to the Toothy brush. So the Toothy brush I'm going to use at the mid size, and let's zoom in. I'm going to go back to that blue that we had earlier. And the Toothy brush is also pressure sensitive. If you apply light pressure, it's almost as if you're using a watercolor brush that's quite dry and you're seeing the tooth of the paper. But if you apply heavy pressure, you actually don't see the tooth. So in order to get the best results from this, apply light pressure. And you can also fill in shapes with this one, with the lighter pressure, and you get that kind of a look, which is quite interesting. Now let's move on to Dry Saturation Shift, which is the next brush. And I'm using this at the mid size, to zoom in right here. So same thing with this brush, pressure sensitive. So if I use light pressure, this is very light pressure. You see, it's kind of like the Toothy brush, but a bit different in terms of the texture. Now if I use heavy pressure, I get this kind of look. But the most interesting looks are when you change up the pressure as you're applying the paint. So if I use light pressure to start, and then I build up the pressure. So do you see? I'm getting this very interesting variation where there's a lighter color here, and then you're getting a lot more darkness here. And this is also great for filling in shapes as well. And depending on how much pressure you apply, you'll get a slightly different edge. So these are more of the drier watercolor brushes. This is a bit more wet. Now let's move on to the pigment shifters. These are really fun, so let's get into it. So I'm going to turn off this specialty watercolor layer, tap on pigment shifters, and turn that layer on. So there's a Pigment Shifter A and a B. And as I mentioned, whenever there's an A and a B, very similar brushes, but something is going to be a bit different. So Pigment Shifter A, if you see the edge, quite a different edge compared to Pigment Shifter B. Now you might be thinking, what's a pigment shifter? Let's talk about that. So make sure that you have the brush selected and zoom in. This brush is pressure sensitive, and depending on how much pressure you apply, you will get a different value. So do you see, I'm applying more and more pressure as I'm moving along, and basically you'll see that the color is getting darker and darker and quite dark. So this is basically like you're taking watercolor paint, and this is a lot more water and this is less water. So it is shifting in terms of how much pigment is there. So hence pigment shifter. And you might be wondering, well, I could probably just use some of the other brushes to create this effect. You definitely could, but you would need to keep changing the color in the color wheel. You don't have to do that with this brush. With this brush, you can get a lighter value and a much darker value just by changing up the pressure. So I would use this brush in a painting where you have a lot of different elements, for example, leaves or berries, where you need to create many of them, and you want all of them to have a slightly different value. Pigment Shifter B. So Pigment Shifter B has a slightly different edge, same concept. Light pressure, zoom in. You get a dark edge, you apply more pressure, you're getting more pigment mixed in there. You can get pretty dark with this too. So very similar, but you have a different edge. You can see this is more jagged, this is less jagged, but it's a lot darker. So depending on the type of edge you want, pick the right brush. Now, I wanted to tell you that Pigment Shifter B has this really cool effect. I'm going to show you this with a darker color. And I'm going to go up in size. So let's create a circle, and don't lift your pencil. Keep the pressure light, and then just kind of change up the pressure in one area. Do you see what happened here? It's kind of like there's little dots of pigment. Let me show you this again. Don't lift the pencil and then press a little hard. You will get little dots of pigment that just flow everywhere, and you get a different result every time you do this. Do you see? So that's kind of the cool thing with this brush. Let me zoom in and show you. It's quite an interesting effect. Okay, so now let's move on to the next layer. So go to the layers menu, let's turn off pigment shifters, and then tap on shape makers and overlay and turn that on. Now, shape makers, you might be wondering what's a shape maker. So sometimes you want to paint in a much more loose style. And let me tell you, trying to paint in a loose style with the basic watercolor brushes just doesn't work. So for example, let's say I wanted to paint in a loose style. Do you see every time I lift my pencil, I'm getting the overlap? It's a little hard to paint in the loose style with those brushes. That's why I made the shape makers. So the shape maker brushes, there's two of them. They have slightly different edges, and they allow you to create a shape in a looser style, and then you can apply a watercolor effect to that shape, and you don't have to worry about the overlap and none of that. So let me show you an example. So I'm going to do kind of the same floral shape that I had earlier. And this brush allows you to create the shape that still has that watercolor edge. Do you see that edge is a bit jagged, much like it is in watercolor? And then what you can do is you can apply a watercolor texture on top of it. So what you want to do for that is basically change that shape to white. So change that shape to white, and then you can create a watercolor effect on top of it by tapping on your layers menu and creating another layer on top, and then making it a clipping mask. And then I can go into any of the brushes that I'd like, for example, Watercolor Overlay, pick any color that I want, and then create that watercolor effect. And I can keep adding on effects to this, which I'll show you in a minute. But basically the Shape Maker brush allows you to paint in a more loose style, which you can't really get with the other brushes. So now I'm going to go back and let's select Shape Maker B. I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'm going to select dark color, and I'm going to make sure that I'm on that Shape Maker's layer. And then I'm going to show you Shape Maker B. So similar shape, kind of like a floral, very loose. But do you see? There's a difference in the edge. This has a slightly different edge compared to this one. So they're both really good for making looser shapes, but they have different edges. And it is very much pressure sensitive. So those are the Shape Maker brushes. And now I'm going to show you the overlay brushes. So in order to use the overlay brushes, you need to create a shape first. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a circle and then maybe some squiggles. I'm going to do the same thing here. We have a circle and then a squiggly line. So now what I want to do is I'm going to make this white so then I can add on the watercolor effect. If you try to add a watercolor effect to this as it is, it won't really show up, because the watercolor brushes are transparent and then the black will show up, and you don't want that. That's why you have to make these white. The fastest way to do this, if you have a bunch of different shapes, is just to go to your adjustments menu, tap on hue, saturation, and brightness, and then increase your brightness all the way. So what happens is all of those shapes now have turned white, and also the texture has turned white, but that's okay. So what we're going to do now, we've changed that to white. We're going to go to this clipping mask layer that we created, and we are going to go to Watercolor Overlay. Tap on this, tap on any color that you like. I'm gonna go back to that blue that we had earlier, and I'm going to fill this in. So what it does is it gives your shape a watercolor effect. I'm going to do the same thing here, and then I'll add on some more effects. So the Watercolor Overlay brush is the brush that I would use to create that watercolor look on top of any shapes that I've made with the Shape Maker. That's the first step, and you'll see that there is some variation. And then what I would do is add on more effects. So let's go to the Pigment Bleed Overlay brush. And let's change up the color so you can really see this. And the Pigment Bleed brush, I'm going to use at the smallest size. I want to show you what that looks like, and then we'll use it at a larger size. So let's zoom in here. So what it does is it adds some pigment that's kind of bleeding in to your shape. And I always start with the edges and then I move in. So you can create interesting looks. If you use it at a slightly larger size, start with the outsider shape, and then work your way in. And what you'll see is it's like the pigment is bleeding in. So that's the Pigment Bleed. Now let's move on to the next brushes. So I'm going to turn off these two layers here. I'm going to tap on Overlay brushes and turn that on. So these are all overlay brushes, so they are meant to be used with the clipping mask. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some shapes with the Shape Maker first. Let's use Shape Maker A, and I'm going to do this in a white, just so I don't have to change the color again. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to create a circle. And I'm going to create another circle here as well. You can always do this in another color first and then change it to white. And then I'll show you what these brushes can do. And as I mentioned, what you want to do is create a clipping mask. So create another layer, tap on it, and tap on clipping mask. And then you want to add the color here. So I'm going to add a watercolor overlay first. That's the base layer for these shapes. I'm going to do this in that blue. So that's the first layer. And then I'll show you what you can do with the other fun brushes. So let's go to Hard Edge Overlay A. This is one of my favorite brushes to get a very realistic watercolor effect. So I'm going to go in and change up the hue to something a little bit different so you can really see it. And with this brush, you want to start out with the, let's see, yes, I'm on the right layer. You want to start out with the edges first and work your way in. And what it will do, you see I'm getting this hard edge here, kind of like when you have a watercolor bloom. And then you want to soften your pressure to erase some of the pigment. And then what it will create is this very interesting effect, like you've added pigment, another color, and it's spread out and you have this hard edge and it's very light where it's not a hard edge. So you'll notice that this is something that will create different effects depending on how much pressure you apply. So if you apply a lot of pressure, you get a very saturated color, but then when you start to release the pressure, it starts to remove some of that pigment. And this is something that I love to do because it creates a watercolor look that looks a little bit more realistic than just plain digital watercolor. There's Hard Edge Overlay A and a B. A and B have slightly different textures. This one has a little bit of, I guess, more of a salt texture. So if you were to add salt on top of your pigment, that kind of texture. So it's a little bit different. I'm going to show you this with a darker color so you can really see. So do you see that texture there? That's what you get, but you can always remove that by lightening the pressure a little bit. So depending on how you use this brush, I'm going to do this at a larger size. You can create that interesting texture like that, and then you can erase some of it by lightening your pressure. So very interesting looks, and each time you use it, you're going to get a slightly different effect. Now let's go to Grainy Pigment Overlay A. So these two are both grainy pigment. Sometimes I like to add that just to add a little bit more texture so it's not so flat looking. And typically what I do is I select the color that I have in the shape, and then I go a little bit darker by going at a diagonal, zoom in, and then just lightly, you see this? You're adding, just by touching, a little bit of that grainy pigment, which just makes it look a little bit more interesting. So this is very, very small pigment grains. Now, if you want it to be bigger, Grainy Pigment Overlay B, much bigger. And then you get some areas that are a bit darker. And if that's too much for you, you can always tap on N and change the opacity. So you can change up the look and it will look a bit different. So if I do it at, say, 75, it's less intense. But these brushes really elevate your shapes, and you don't have to use these brushes on shapes made with the shape maker. You can also use these brushes on shapes that you've made with the simple watercolor pigmented, even some of these. You can use these overlay brushes on any shape. So for example, if I go to simple watercolor pigmented, and let's say I could create a shape here. It's a bit dark. Let's select a different color. And then I can go to the clipping mask layer and use Hard Edge Overlay A or any of these brushes, change up the color a bit, and you can get that hard edge overlay look. One thing to keep in mind is that when you are using these overlay brushes on shapes that you've made that are transparent, you won't see the effect as much because it will be a bit transparent. But when you use these brushes on any shape that you've made with the Shape Maker, you will see the effect a lot more because the shapes made with Shape Maker are not transparent. Okay, so now let's move on to detail brushes. So let's turn off those layers and tap on detail brushes. Okay, so these brushes are brushes that I would use for detail. So after I've completed the shapes and added on the cool effects, and then it's time for details, I would use these brushes. So these are dual color, both of these. So let me show you that. So let's go to the dual color detail brush. Select any two colors that you like. I'm going to select that blue, and then I'm going to select like a green. And then let's test this brush out together. So I'm using the smaller preset size, and this is pressure sensitive. If you apply less pressure, you will get more of the first color. And if you apply more pressure, you get a thicker line and more of the second color. It basically mixes the two colors for you. So if you really want a wide difference between the different colors, select colors that are really different. So let's say I select yellow. Yellow and blue, very different. So what you'll get is that sort of effect. So depending on how much pressure you apply, you'll see more of one color or more of the other. Now let's go to the dual color Toothy detail. And for this, I'll select that blue, and maybe I will select red, just to show you. And let's tap on dual color Toothy. So these are both detail brushes. This one's a bit toothier, as in you will see more of the tooth of the paper when you apply less pressure. So you see what's happening here. I'm seeing that tooth of the paper. So it's kind of like a dry watercolor brush, not quite saturated. And when I use heavier pressure, I'll see more of the second color. So that's quite a lovely effect. If you want to see more of a difference, as I mentioned, pick colors that are quite different or pick values that are quite different. So if I changed the value of that red to a lighter value and then use this brush, I would see more of a difference. So that's a little trick. Whenever you want to see a bigger difference, pick two colors that are very different or have very different values. Okay, so that's the Toothy detail. Then we have the ink bleed liner. This is great if you want to add color that is not transparent and you just want to have kind of that ink bleed look. So let me show you this with black. So imagine you're using black pen and there's a little bit of a bleed to this, not too much. If you zoom in, you can see that there's a little bit of a bleed, not too much. And this is also pressure sensitive. So if you use less pressure, you get a thinner line. If you use heavy pressure, you get a thicker line. And if you vary the pressure, you get thin and thick lines. So it's really great for adding very interesting details. And there is a tapered edge. In order to get that tapered edge, make sure you're not using the same pressure throughout your stroke, that you're starting out with light pressure and then building up and then releasing the pressure as you lift. That's really the trick to the tapered edge. The tapered end, is just to kind of lift up off the screen rather than keeping the pencil on your screen the entire time. So that's the ink bleed liner. And now let's move on to the next layer. Tap on the layers menu. Let's turn off the detail brushes. And then let's tap on paint splatter and turn that on. So the paint splatter brush is a fun brush to add some interesting splatters. That's the last brush here. And it is pressure sensitive. Let me go to the preset size, which is 25. Zoom in. And if you apply light pressure, you get teeny tiny splatters. You can get really small baby sized splatters, so cute. But if you apply heavier pressure, you're going to get much bigger splatters. And the best way to use this brush is to vary the pressure during the stroke. So you get light pressure and heavy pressure, the benefit of both. So as with all of the brushes in the set, changing up the pressure is key. Now, if you're struggling to get these effects when you're using these brushes, struggling to follow along, it might just be that you need to change your pressure curve setting. So I have a video on brush troubleshooting and I walk through the pressure curve. So maybe you need to change your pressure curve and hopefully you can find one that works for you. Because all of us use our pencils a little bit differently. Some people apply more pressure, some people don't. So you may need to change the pressure curve. But if everything is working fine for you so far, then that pressure curve that comes with Procreate is perfect. Okay, so let's move on. Tap on the layers menu, uncheck that. And now let's talk about the smudgers and erasers. Let's turn that on. So there are 2 smudgers and 2 erasers. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to lay down some pigment and then we can talk about these brushes. So I'm going to pick, let's see, maybe I will pick the Toothy. Why not? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay down some color here. Here, and here, and here as well. And then because the smudgers require 2 different colors for you to really see the difference, I'm going to have 2 different colors here. So I'm going to lay down some more pigment here, and some more here. Okay, so now let's talk about the smudgers. So in order to use the smudgers, you need to use the smudge library. So not the regular brush library, the smudge library. So tap on that and then make sure you're on the Amazing Watercolor Brush set. Go all the way to the top and you'll see Smudger A and Smudger B. They're both a bit different. Smudger A, let's tap on that. And depending on the size, you will get a very different result. My experience tells me that you should always start smudging at the smallest size and then work your way up as necessary. Because if you start the smudge at a very big size, it's just too much. So I always like to start out small and then work my way up. So what you can do with the smudger is just gently smudge out the edges and you get this kind of look. What I'm finding is I might want to go up a size. So tap on the middle preset size. And what you can do is you can start to move that pigment. And you can also move it here. So the thing to keep in mind with the smudgers is that you want to smudge from a place that has pigment outwards. If you start to smudge from here, which is outside, inwards, what's going to happen is the white is going to start to smudge in. I don't want that. So if you want to smudge your edges, go outwards. That way the pigment will flow out. And also keep in mind that when you are smudging, you're going to lose some of that inherent texture underneath. That's just how it goes with smudgers. So this smudger is great for a very soft smudging effect, and the size really does matter. So make sure you start out with a smaller size and work your way up. Smudger B. Let's go to Smudger B. Smudger B, similar concept. Start out smaller and work your way up. So if I start out smaller, do you see this smudger is a little bit different? You apply less pressure and what you'll see is the pigment moves out in a slightly different way. I'm lifting my pencil every single time. And what you can create is that interesting bleed effect where it's not the same as this effect. This is a very soft effect. This is like the pigment is bleeding in, but it's not as soft. So I generally would say that the best way to use this, I'm going to undo this, is to go in one direction. Because whenever you're using watercolor, usually the pigment will go in one direction. So I'm going to go up a size here to the middle preset size, and I want to start to move this pigment this way. So do you see it's like the pigment is moving into the red area. So it is definitely a very different effect compared to the other smudger. This is more of a directional effect than that one. That one's much softer. So depending on your needs, decide on which smudger to use. I generally pick Smudger A. Now let's talk about the edge eraser and the huge eraser. So the erasers need to be used with the eraser menu. So tap on the eraser menu, and I'm gonna go back to the Amazing Watercolor set, and then tap on edge eraser. So the edge eraser has that edge, kind of like a watercolor edge. So if you ever wanted to erase the edge but keep that watercolory look, you can use this edge eraser. Do you see? You still have that interesting look. So if I do this in the center, you still have that jagged edge. And it's really great for doing effects where you want to make it look like you used, I guess, white masking fluid, and then you paint it on top of it. That's really a great way to create that sort of effect. Then we have the huge eraser. So the huge eraser is different. It doesn't have an edge. So the huge eraser is really great when you want to clear a large portion of your screen quite easily. I just like having that there, so that's why I offered it, because sometimes I just want to erase everything really quickly. It's just satisfying to be able to do that. So that's the huge eraser. Okay, so then let's move on to the pencils. Let's tap on the pencils and uncheck that, and then make sure that we have selected pencils. So there are two pencils that come with this set. There's a tapered sketch and a rough sketch. I'm going to pick a dark gray, almost black, and show you this. So let's go up to the top, tapered sketch. I love to have watercolor with some pencil effects sometimes, so I'll add this to do details, but I'll also use it for sketching. This brush is pressure sensitive, so depending on how much pressure you apply, you will get different results. And it has a tapered edge. To get that tapered end, just lift your pencil off the screen really quickly. So this is a great brush to do some sketching and also to add details if you like to have that kind of colored pencil detail. And then we have rough sketch. Similar concept, but different texture. Definitely pressure sensitive. And I actually love this one the most. It's really great for adding in little details after you've done a watercolor painting, if you like that look. So yes, two different brushes, both pressure sensitive, but different textures, and then both great for doing some sketching. So that covers all of the brushes in the set, but not only do you get brushes, you also get paper canvases. So let me just quickly walk you through the paper canvases. So I'm going to go back to my gallery, and then I am going to go to the smaller size. So there's two sizes, there's a medium and a large. The medium is an 8 by 10 inch, and the large canvas that you get is 4,800 by 6,000 pixels. So that's 16 by 20 inch. Quite big, and you can always crop these. So I'm going to go to that 8 by 10. I'm going to move this. And let me just walk you through the layers so you know how to use them. So what you'll see in the layers menu is you will see a paper background and a paper overlay. I'll explain what that means in a second. And then you'll have layers where you can paint. And you can always add more layers here to paint. There's absolutely no reason you can only paint in 2 layers. You can keep adding more layers. But I just wanted to give you 2 to get started. So you want to paint in the paint here layer. So let's just do a quick painting. Well, just add some color. And then maybe add some pigmented color too. Then you can kind of see what I'm talking about as I walk you through this. So let's zoom in. So what you'll see here is that whenever you paint, you're getting that watercolor texture of the paper. If you want to turn that on and off and change that up, you most definitely can. Let's move this to the side. There's a paper background, which you can turn on and off. So I like to paint with the paper background turned on, but if I'm printing, I like to turn it off. It's just cleaner. It prints way better if you don't have a paper background. But I still have the paper texture on that watercolor. Let's turn that back on. And then there's a paper overlay. That is a paper texture that shows up on what you've painted. If I turn that off, do you see there's no paper texture here anymore? I'm only seeing the paper background. I actually prefer to have the paper texture turned on. The watercolor brushes look so much better when you have that paper texture turned on. And you can change up how this looks. Just tap on this to open up the group. And what you'll see is there's two paper textures here and a recycled texture as well. And you can change the settings. So right now, my paper texture at the bottom is set to max in terms of the opacity. And then I have a second one here. If I tap on CB, you'll see that the opacity is 30. Let's zoom in a little bit. And what you can do is you can increase it. If you increase it, you see much more of the paper texture. So it's totally up to you what you want to do. You can reduce it, you can increase it, and create different looks that way. There's also a recycled paper texture. Tap on CB, and you can increase the opacity of it. And what you'll see is you'll see little teeny tiny pieces of like recycled material, which creates an interesting effect. You see all of those? That's that recycled paper texture. If you want to turn that off, you can do that. Do you see how those disappeared? Yeah, totally up to you. So just tap on CB and you can change the opacity. So this is really totally up to you. And also with the paper background too. If you want it to be less apparent, just tap on the paper background, open up that group, go to paper texture, tap on N. Oops, I didn't tap on it, I turned it off. Tap on N, and then you can increase and decrease it. So it's really up to you. I give you that flexibility. You're the artist. You decide what you want to do. So yeah, that is the basic structure here. You have an overlay and a background, and then you can paint in between. Now, what I would suggest is don't paint accidentally on the paper overlay or the paper background, because that would ruin things. So try to avoid that. In order to avoid doing that by mistake, what I like to do is lock them. But I didn't lock them so you could make changes. But I would suggest after you've made the changes that you need to just lock it so you don't accidentally paint on them. Swipe to the left and lock. And that way you won't accidentally paint there. And then to unlock, swipe to the left again and unlock. Very simple thing. So yeah, that covers the basics of the paper canvas. I've covered the basics of the brushes, and I will be doing many more illustration tutorials once I release some other brush sets. I have some other brush sets that I wanted to release, and after that, we're gonna have a lot of fun creating fun illustrations. So if you have any suggestions, please do let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye!